are, no matter what tribulation we go through, no matter what problems we face, no matter what the day brings or what the night dreams, our God is faithful, our God is able, and our God is great.
Amen.
And we need to fortify ourselves and be lost completely into His identity. And that's been our Sonomic theme of the year. Our Sonomic theme of the year has been identity in Christ. Understanding that identity doesn't come from you. Identity doesn't come from self. Identity doesn't come from ability. Identity doesn't come from skill. Identity doesn't come from hard work. Identity doesn't come from building character. Identity comes from Christ. And as we build that identity of Christ in us through the cooperation of His indwelling Holy Spirit and through the infusing of power from the throne room of heaven into our personal lives, changes happen, not because we work them, but because we stop fighting God who's working in us. And so, we are on Sermon 2 within our Sonomic theme of identity in Christ, our mini-theme within that, our sub-theme on the Sabbath. And last week, I spoke a lot about what we called the rest of the Sabbath. And literally, the Sabbath meaning that we are resting from our own works. We are resting from our own abilities. We are resting from our own power, and we're resting from our own strength. And we're resting from doing. And we talked about that the Sabbath is about the commandment that you don't do by not doing. You just stop doing. And that's also how salvation works. You stop your good works and you rest in His good works. And then He produces more good works in you. And so we talked about the Sabbath in that context. And today we're going to talk about the Sabbath a little bit differently. We're going to talk about the Sabbath in the context of the test of the Sabbath. And so there's the mini theme is the rest of the Sabbath. Today is the test of the Sabbath. Next week we'll look at the best of the Sabbath.
Amen.
But in the test of the Sabbath, what I want to talk about is the fact that it's no secret that there are many Christians that are greatly opposed to the idea of Sabbath.
Amen.
There are many Christians who think Sabbath is crazy. There are many Christians who think Sabbath is an Old Testament thing, and it really has nothing to do with New Testament Christians. And they think that New Testament Christians who keep Sabbath are legalists. That they keep Sabbath as an ability or an attempt to complete or to keep the law in terms of a means of salvation. Now, if you were here last week, you know that we don't teach that. And if you weren't, you can see it on YouTube. You know that we talked about the Sabbath is not a symbol at all of what you're doing, but where you're resting, and that rest is Jesus. So the idea that Christians who keep Sabbath are legalists doesn't hold water. What did we say last week? We said we don't keep the Sabbath to be saved. We keep the Sabbath because we are saved.
Amen.
And it's the outward expression of the internal rest in Jesus. We likened it to baptism. We don't get baptized to be saved. We get baptized because we are saved. We likened it to marriage. We don't get married so that someone will love us. I hope not. We get married because someone does love us and we love someone. These are all outward expressions of internal things. And so we want to look at the evidence in the New Testament, and we're going to particularly look at one really strong piece of evidence. We'll tie in some others, but we're particularly going to look at what I find, in my opinion, to be the strongest evidence that Jesus intended Christians to keep Sabbath for the rest of the duration of Earth's history. And it's interesting that it comes from Matthew. Jesus' two greatest sermons are in Matthew. Now, if you ask me, for my money, The Gospel of John is my favorite gospel of the four. I love the Gospel of John. It's full of these stories of Jesus' personal encounters. But in Matthew, we find Jesus' two greatest sermons, and they are linked. One is towards the first part of Matthew, a little bit in, but towards the first. Chapters 5 through 7. It's called the Sermon on the Mount, right? And the other is towards the end of Matthew. Not quite the end, but towards the end. It's like the first one. It's not quite the beginning. It's not quite the end. It's Matthew 24 and 25, and it is called the Sermon of Olives. In Matthew 5 through 7, which is the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus continually talks about the importance of being a follower of him. In fact, it is probably the greatest material on what discipleship is. And Jesus talks about the role of the law. And he says, not one dot, not one tittle changes until the earth ends. And so that brings about an interesting situation, because this same idea recurs again in the Sermon of Olives. And that's where we'd like to focus. Both of these sermons go together. Both of these sermons have a link. And these are both the two important sermons I think Jesus preached. The Sermon on the Mount, by far, the most important. And the Sermon of Olives is that sermon which is really a template of the book of Revelation. John's vision will be based on that sermon. So we're going to turn to Matthew 24, and we're going to jump right into it, and we're going to begin to look at the text right away, because the text is pretty important. And so in Matthew 24, in verse 1, it says, Jesus left the what? Temple. The temple. I want you to stay with me today, because the theological nuances are going to be important to us. Jesus left where? The temple. You sure? Yep. Okay, so we're dealing with temple at the beginning. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the what? Temple. So this is about Jesus leaving the temple. The disciples came to him and they wanted to ask about what? The buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Jesus is leaving the what? The temple. The disciples come to it and ask about what? The temple. And Jesus completely changes the topic and talks about the destruction of the temple. And what he says is that, you can marvel at this temple, you can look at its beauty, you can look at its might, you can look at all the sacrifices that happen here, the dailies, you can consider all of that, but I'm going to tell you something right now, it's all coming down. I'm going to tell you something right now. The day is coming when there will not be even one stone upon another, and that day came. Right? We know this, right? Now, you can go to Jerusalem, and you can see the Wailing Wall, and the Wailing Wall is the wall that the temple once sat on, but not the temple. And so this is important, because what this tells us is this prophecy that Jesus is talking about actually happened. It actually was fulfilled, just like Jesus told his disciples. They're glorying in the temple. They're like, "Look at this temple, Jesus, isn't it great? Look at these buildings. What do you think about it?" I'm not impressed. I tell you, they're all coming down. I won't even let one stone be on top of each other. And it goes on here in verses 3 and 4. Now this is where he's moving to the Mount of Olives. So this conversation is going. They're walking from the temple. They're going to the Mount of Olives. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him, we could say again, privately now, because the crowds are gone. They're not at the temple anymore. And what they want to do is they now want to ask Jesus a little bit more deeper questions than they could ask in public. Because, Jesus had this thing where he could embarrass you accidentally. It's like, you think you're doing something great. You're like, look what our God has done for us in this great temple, Jesus. Shouldn't we all just be in awe of him? He's like, nah, I'm going to tear it down. What are you worrying about that? I'm going to take it all down. So you get a little shy sometimes to ask Jesus something in public. You never know what he's going to do with it. And so they wait, and they talk to him privately, and now they're up on the mountain. They're on the Mount of Olives, and they're talking to him privately, and now it's getting intimate, and now it's getting directed, and now the nuances matter, because they can sit with their rabbi and ask him directly, what is he talking about? And as they sat at the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will be these things? What things? The things he told them as they were walking from the temple, right? Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the what? The what? Are you with me? The nuances matter. When will these things be? And they are what? The destruction of the temple, right? And what? There's a second question they're asking. The sign. The sign of your coming. And the end of the age. It's a two-part question. One is the destruction of the temple. One is the end of the age and his coming. And Jesus answered, see that no one leads you astray. Now, if Jesus tells you, like, they're in private, okay? And Jesus comes to them, and they're talking, and they're saying, what were you talking about out there? This destruction of the temple, and when are you going to come again? You keep talking about leaving us, Jesus. And Jesus begins to talk to them privately, and he says, look, I'm talking about these things, and what I want you to know about these things, and I think if he wanted them to know, he wants you to know. These things that I'm about to tell you now in private. The reason I provoked you when you asked about the temple, because I wanted to tell you something in private. I wanted to continue the conversation, so I deliberately asked you something that would make you follow up. By the way, Jesus does that to you. He provokes your curiosity. And now we're in private, and now we can talk. And what I want you to know about these things that I'm going to share with you, don't you let anyone deceive you. Now, if Jesus tells you what he's about to say is so important that you should not allow anyone to deceive you, what should be your assumption? Somebody's going to try. Right? Jesus is all-knowing. Jesus is not just wasting his words. If Jesus tells you, pay attention, this is important, don't be deceived about this, that means that Jesus believes that there is a deception coming about the things that Jesus is about to share. Which is why we must be crystal clear about what Jesus is talking about so that there can be absolutely no confusion on the matter, because Jesus already told us, pay attention because you will or could be deceived. Don't let anyone deceive you. He says, the first thing I'm talking about is the destruction of the temple. And the second thing I'm talking about is the events leading to the end of the age or my second coming. Which are the same thing. And so we know what Jesus is talking about. We know the reason he's talking about it. He's talking about it so there can be no deception. And so if we put it this way, we can see that this prophetic sermon that Jesus is giving, by the way, which takes place in both Matthew 24 and 25, to unpack it just a little bit for you, 24 is the theology of the sermon, and 25 is 3 parables that illustrate how people live out the theology of that sermon, waiting for Jesus to return. It's a beautifully written sermon. You have deep theology in 24, and in 25 you have these 3 parables. The parable of the wedding. The parable with the 10 virgins, right? The parable of the talents. and the parable of the sheep and goats, which all illustrate the theology and how it's lived out, found in 24. And so the Sermon of Olives, Matthew 24 and 25, has to do with the destruction of the temple and the coming of the end of the age or the return of Christ. And that is the key concept that Jesus is dealing with. And we know it's the key concept because Jesus himself said it's the key concept. And it began at the temple and moved into private. And Jesus said, I'm glad you asked, because now we're going to get more serious. Because I don't want you to be deceived. Church, I'm telling you, that warning was not just for the disciples. That warning was for me and you. Jesus doesn't want us to be deceived. So we should pay close attention to what he has to say. And so let's read verses 5 and 6 together. They're very important verses. Can we read them together? Let's do it together. We do this so well, right? We're Adventists, right? Let's do it together. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. All these things are going to happen. Don't be upset. The end is not yet. Which is basically the opposite of what we do. We turn on the news, we hear there's a problem in Palestine, we hear about a bombing someplace, we're, oh, it's the end, and we run around like crazy. The exact opposite of what Jesus said, isn't it? He says, look, expect these things. They're normal, and yes, they're signs. They're leading up to my coming. But there has always been wars. There have always been earthquakes. There have always been problems. All I'm telling you is what has always been will always be until I come. And yes, they are signs that the earth is getting old. And yes, they are signs that man is disobedient to me. And yes, they are signs that I'm coming. But they're not the big sign. Sometimes I think of them as mile markers on the highway, you know. You know how directionally challenged I am. You know that I don't even go home to my house without my GPS. I always count the mile markers along the highway or the interstate, wherever I'm going, and I always know what exit I have to get off on, and if it's exit 105 on whatever highway, you know, I'm paying attention to exit 86 and 92 and 101. Because those are the little signs leading to the big exit sign. And this is what Jesus is saying. He's like, all these things are little signs leading to the big sign. They let you know that you are on the right highway, and they let you know that you are traveling the right way. And by the way, if you can't see these little mile marker signs, it might be that you're going the wrong way on a one-way street. So we shouldn't panic and go, oh! But if you can't see them, you have a whole different problem. You're heading the wrong direction. They have their purpose, but let's not overstate their purpose. And so it goes on, and let's continue. Let's do 7 and 8 together. Can we do that together? 4? Oh, no, we got to do it together. Come on. We got better rhythm than that. 4, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be what? Famines, earthquakes, in various places, but all the beginnings of birth pains. You would think when we see these things that Jesus is going to snap his fingers and be right back the way people go on about it, but Jesus says it's just the beginning of labor. It's just the beginning of labor. You know, if you think about this list, all we know is that we're in labor. That's all we know. You know, I get these questions all the time about prophecy, people panicking and people like, what's going to happen? And, what happens if this person gets elected or that person gets elected? Which person do you think is going to bring in the end? All of them. Jesus says, these things are important for you to notice, but they just tell you you're in labor. And that's all they tell you. He goes on to say, let's continue in 9 and 10. He goes on to say in 9 and 10, you're going to read with me? Then they will deliver you up to what? Tribulation. And put you to death. And you will be what? Hated by all nations. For what? My name's sake. And then many shall fall away and betray one another and what? And hate one another. Jesus says that when you realize that you're in the birth pains, when you realize that you're pregnant and it's too late to abort, persecution's coming. What he's talking about now is persecution. He talked about wars. He talked about rumors of wars. He talked about unrest. He talked about earthquakes. He talked about famines. But he says, after all of that comes persecution. We continue on to 11, and let's read 11 to 13 together. And many what? Many false prophets will arise. And what? Lead many astray. And because of what? Lawlessness will be increased. And the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end. Wait. I didn't hear the last part. The one who what? Endures to the end. The one who endures to the end will be saved. Did you catch why he said persecution comes? Because that's the tie back to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, until the end of the age, not one dot or tittle leaves the law. And Jesus says here in Matthew 24, I'm not making it up, it's right on the screen, it's right in the text. And because of the what? Lawlessness. Many's what? Many's love will grow cold. I think the King James says wax cold. You know, God's law is not there to be restrictive. God's law is not there to punish us. God's law is not there to control us. God's law is there to ensure that we all get loved. Because it's not loving when somebody kills you or takes your spouse or disrespects you when you deserve honor. You see, and when the law is removed, you could go to Thessalonians, you could see what Paul talks about when the lawless one comes. The son of perdition, he calls him. I don't have time to go there, but those of you who've been coming to the Friday night study know we did an in-depth study about him. But it's the lawlessness that produces cold love. And produces the climate of hate and produces the climate of persecution. But Jesus says, hold on. Jesus says, don't give up. Jesus says, endure. Jesus says, but the one who, what? Endures to the end. The one who endures to the end will be saved. Don't give up. And don't panic. And don't you run around like a chicken with your head cut off because you saw one of the mile markers on the news. We still haven't got to the big stuff yet. We're going there. But we still, in Jesus' Sermon of Olives, we still haven't got to the big stuff yet. But we're, what's the expression? Majoring in the minors. We're all about the little signs and rarely about the big signs. And what Jesus is wanting to do in this point of the book, this point of the sermon, when he begins to talk about endurance, and endurance being the way to be saved, and endurance being the only thing that's going to get you through this persecution that is worse than any persecution that has ever been on the earth. Because it comes because they remove God's standard of how humans deserve dignity. God's law is about dignity and equality and intrinsic value on everyone, sinner and saint alike. And when you take away his law, there's nothing to determine who gets dignity or how they get dignity. And so Jesus says, look, the only way you're going to get through this is by endurance. He goes on to say, now's the big stuff. We got to read this together. You ready? This is the big stuff. Everyone together. You can tell it's big. I made the font bigger. And this gospel of the kingdom will be what?
Proclaimed
throughout the whole world as what? As a testimony to what? All nations. And then the end will come. I don't think we get it, okay? There's going to be persecution. It's going to be hard. There's going to be all these little signs, and then it's going to get really tough. But if you endure, if you rest and trust him to take you through it, if you endure, you will be saved. And the very next thing he says, and this gospel, what gospel? The gospel that teaches you how to have endurance under pressure. The gospel that tells you how to rest in Jesus. The gospel that tells you, hold on, be patient, trust me even when you don't see the out. It's this gospel. What gospel?
This gospel.
This gospel of the kingdom, proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony. As a testimony to all the nations. And then that's your exit sign. That's where you get off the highway. You want to run around with your head cut off and say, Jesus is coming, he's coming right away. This is what you're looking for. But the irony I have as a Seventh-day Adventist pastor is, quite frankly, quite honestly, I'll try to be gentle. We're always majoring in the minors, looking at these little signs and making mountains out of molehills, and not even concerned about the big sign. If we really believe Jesus was coming, we'd be looking for this exit and aiming toward this exit and guiding everything we do towards this exit. That's why we merge churches together. That's why we have an internet ministry and we're streaming to the world right now. That's why we have a YouTube channel that we keep asking you to share with your friends. That's why we have a communication card where we want to be able to connect with you. That's why every morning I'm on the internet doing a live interactive devotion with you. That's why every Wednesday night we come here and pray. That's why every Friday night we come here and have an expository Bible study. We do all that because we are aiming this ship towards that exit sign.
Amen.
But it's interesting because the very people who don't partake in any of that stuff are the people who will meet me at Sabbath at the door and say, these little signs, do you know about them? And do you know that the apostasy is about to happen? I had one person in my congregation was so concerned about the identity of the Antichrist, so concerned that everyone should know about it, so concerned. I asked him, can you show me one place in the Bible where the word Antichrist is? It is in the Bible. But he didn't know where they were. In fact, he went to the very books that say nothing about the Antichrist. And I said, how are you going to go out there and preach this message if you can't even find it in your Bible? Why would anyone listen to you? That's what I mean about majoring in the minors. if we really believe the sign of the times, if we really believe Jesus is coming, if we really believe the Sermon of Olives, if we really are Seventh-day Adventists, if we really believe the classic sermon title, The Sign of the Times, we would be gearing everything we do as a church and everything we do as an individual outside of the church towards this exit. But the reality is, too often, we're traveling the opposite direction on the one-way highway. And so, this is the sign. This is the sign. And what I want you to know about this sign is this truth. When you find this sign, the gospel, this gospel, the one that helps you with endurance, the symbol of the rest of this gospel will not be far from it. Remember what we said last week. The rest in Jesus is what the Sabbath is about. The Sabbath is the outward expression of the internal rest in Jesus. And so if Jesus is saying in this sermon that persecution's coming and all these things are going to happen, but the big exit sign is the gospel going to the world, then we would expect to find the outward expression of that gospel being lived out in those who are being persecuted for that gospel, would we not? Let's see if we find it. Let's continue here in verses 15 and 16. It says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel, we preached about that a few weeks ago. You can find it on YouTube. When you find it standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. And then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. When one who is on the housetop, let the one who is on the housetop not go down. Let the one who is on the household not go down. Oh, sorry, apologize, I didn't change my slide there. Let the one who's on the household, housetop, not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Listen, what Jesus is saying is really important. It's really important. He's saying, when this happens, you don't got time to go back home. When this happens, there's no time to go and get your good Sabbath coat on. When this happens, you're out of time. It's time to move, and it's time to do what you should have already been doing. Jesus says, when this happens, something big is about to go down. And watch what comes next. Pray. Pray for what? Are you with me? Read this with me. Pray for what? Pray. What? Pray that your flight may not be when?
In the winter or on the Sabbath.
Or on the Sabbath day. We'll stop there for a minute. When this happens, when you see the gospel finally going forward, when you see that the gospel goes forward despite persecution, in fact, when you see not only does the gospel go forward despite persecution, but persecution actually propels the gospel to go even faster, which is what it did for the early church. When you see that there's no time for anything else, don't go home, don't get your coat, don't do anything. Just do what you're supposed to do. Flee to the mountains. And pray that it's not in the winter. Why? It's not easy to travel in the winter, is it? Or when? On the Sabbath. Jesus says, when this persecution comes, you don't want it to be on Sabbath. This is significant. Jesus says, when this persecution comes, actually, as you're preparing for this persecution, as you see it coming forward, he's urging you to pray that it not be on Sabbath. because there's no time to go home. There's no time to put on your winter coat. There's no time for anything. Just pray that it's not in the winter and pray that it's not on Sabbath. For there will be, you can read this with me, for there will be great, what? Tribulation. Such as has not been seen from when?
From
the beginning of the world until will?
now.
Until now. Nor
And
never will be. And if those days had not been cut, what? Short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. That's pretty powerful statement. But I want you to think about it. If this sermon that Jesus is preaching is about what he said it was about, the destruction of the temple and the end of the age, then Jesus expects his followers to be Sabbath keepers at the time of this persecution. Now, some people will say, oh, no, he's not talking about the end of the world. No, the Sabbath's been done away with. He's not talking about the end of the world. He's talking about the destruction of the temple. Well, okay, you can say that, and you got good biblical grounds to say that. If you want to throw this all out and say this prophecy is not about the end of the world, it's just about the destruction of the temple, okay, I don't agree with you, but I'll go with you. Still, the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D., 40 years approximately after the death of Jesus. You can't get out of the Sabbath. Jesus was explicit. He said, don't let anyone do what? Deceive you. He said, pay attention to what I'm about to tell you because people are going to deceive you. You think the temple's important? It's not. I'm going to tell you what's important. The gospel going to the world, persecution, and the Sabbath. You see, it's Jesus himself who connects end-time events to Sabbath keeping. No, it's not the Seventh-day Adventist Church who made that connection. No, it's not Ellen White who made that connection. No, it's not the book Great Controversy that made the connection, or even Words to the Little Flock. None of that, or early writings. No, that's not where the connection comes from. The connection of Sabbath keeping to the end of the world and the return of Christ and persecution is the heart of the Sermon of Olives. Notice, the persecution increases and increases and increases and increases, and the gospel goes to the world, and Jesus says, pray that it's not on Sabbath that you have to flee. Wow. You can't get rid of the Sabbath in the New Testament unless you're willing to get rid of Jesus and what he told you to pay attention about and not be deceived about. Jesus who ties these events together. It's not church doctrine. It's not dogma. It's not leadership. It's Jesus, because all testing truth is always found in Jesus. Look, you can look all through the New Testament. It's more than self-evident what's going on in the New Testament. Look, more than 85 times in the book of Acts alone. I'm not talking about the whole Bible, just the book of Acts alone. 85 times it says the disciples kept the Sabbath. But you have Christians who will say, there's no evidence for Sabbath keeping in the New Testament. Hey, you don't want that? Okay. The disciples also taught Gentiles to keep Sabbath because that's their argument. They kept it because they were Jewish. No, they were Christians. But they also taught Gentiles to keep it. The book of Hebrews, which we looked at extensively last week, calls the Sabbath a rest that still remains. The author of Hebrews made the point. It's not gone away. In fact, most people haven't even begun to really keep it correctly, he said. Because the correct way of keeping is to keep it in trust that you will endure through. Jesus himself repeatedly calls himself Lord of the Sabbath. Do we really think that Jesus calls himself Lord of something that he doesn't plan to have existing? Why bother? Furthermore, It was the custom of Jesus and the custom of his disciples. Repeatedly see those words custom used. That they went to the synagogue and they worshiped on Sabbath. We're called to follow the Lamb. We're called to follow the Lamb wherever he goes. Revelation 14:4. Jesus goes to the Sabbath because Jesus is the Sabbath. Jesus is the rest from all of our work. And we're called to follow Jesus to the Sabbath, and we're called to rest with Jesus in the Sabbath. Here's what it says in Revelation. You want verses that you build your identity on? If you're a Seventh-day Adventist, here's an identity verse for you. Here is the call for what? What did Jesus say? Those who endure will be. Do you see the connection? Here is the call for endurance of the saints. Those who keep the what? Commandments of God and
their faith in Jesus.
And their faith in Jesus. These things are not mutually exclusive. These things go hand in hand. You both follow commandments and have faith in Jesus. In fact, you follow commandments because you have faith in Jesus. We see that Jesus never separates these two things. My problem, and maybe your problem, is endurance is not easy. I don't know. Some of you are great athletes. Some of you run marathons. Some of you work out in gyms. I am not a great athlete. I have never been a great athlete. I lack endurance. You know, you ever had this experience when you were growing up as a kid? They picked teams for sports, you know? You guys ever have that experience? Where they, you know, you're playing ball, you're going to play basketball, you're going to play baseball, you're going to play something, and they line up everybody, and they make a captain, and they make another captain, and they said, select who you want, and it's always a fight over the best athletes. And you can see where you rank because the selection process goes down. You know, and eventually, you know, if you're me, you get down to being one of the two last people. And you're saying in your heart, if you're not saying it out loud, and sometimes you're saying it out loud, pick me, I don't want to be last. Please pick me. I don't care if I'm second last, but I don't want to be last. But please, I was last the last 5 times. I don't want to be last this time. Everyone's going to laugh at me. I don't want to be last. In fact, just a few months ago, actually just last month, some of the pastors got together and they're going to go hiking together and they're going to do some physical activity. We decided we would do that on one of our professional development days. And I wasn't feeling up to it because I'm not an athletic person. And we were going to do some skill training. And for a moment, I almost like had post-traumatic stress syndrome. Flashback to my childhood because they picked 2 captains and they're like, okay, who do you want to be on your team? And they began to start to pick. And then someone said, no, let's not do that. That's embarrassing to people. I was so glad because I knew I would be picked last. Because I'm not an athlete. Like some of you are, and I'm proud of you, but I'm not. And so I would grow up and I wouldn't want to play ball, and I wouldn't want to go out and do these activities because I was going to be embarrassed every time. But I had a teacher. And that teacher would come to me, and that teacher would say, Vince, keep going. Just keep playing. Just keep doing it. Yeah, you're not going to be picked last. You're probably going to fail. Your team's probably going to lose. I'm going to be honest with you. You're probably going to always be on the losing team. But keep going. Keep enduring. Enduring. And so this teacher would encourage me and tell me to endure. And you know what happened one day? One day, it was like that time of year in Canada. we get to a national event that some of you might know about here. I guess it's shared with America, but most Americans don't do it. It's called Stanley Cup time. Anybody know about the Stanley Cup? Lord Stanley? No one? Hockey? NHL? It's all we do in Canada. They canceled school for the day. And they divided the whole school up into teams. And the whole school was playing off against everyone to see who was the best hockey player in the school. I don't know what happened. I never missed a shot I made that day. I still don't know how I did it. I was in shock myself. But every time I had the puck, I made the shot, got the goal, over and over and over. And, you know, the same people who would laugh at me for not being picked for the teams, they're like laughing because I was doing it. And they were saying, how is this possible? How are you doing this? And I honestly didn't know. Do you know what happened that day? I won the gold medal for most shots in my school. The guy who's always picked last. Never had a day like that again. But I had one. And I had it because of endurance. Because if I hadn't kept playing, I would have never had that day. The Sabbath is that teacher. The Sabbath is that teacher who keeps telling you to endure. The Sabbath is that teacher who says it doesn't matter if you win. The Sabbath is that teacher who says it's not about being on the winning team, it's about playing the game. The Sabbath is the rest in Jesus, which makes you realize you're a winner as long as you're playing with Jesus. The book of Revelation and the book of Matthew tells us to endure to be saved. The purpose of the Sabbath, the test of the Sabbath, is not how holy you are, but your continual putting your faith back in Jesus every week, no matter how your week has been. Because that day is coming when you're going to win the gold medal, and you don't know how, you just know you don't deserve it. Brother Marvin's going to take us in our appeals.
We have this hope that burns within our hearts. Hope in the coming of the Lord. We have this faith that Christ alone imparts. Faith in the promise of His word. We believe that time is here when the nations far and near shall awaken while we sing. Hallelujah, Christ is King. We have this hope that burns within our hearts. Hope in the coming of the Lord.
You've had an opportunity to fill out your card. You still have an opportunity. I'm going to say it again. I said it last week. I know there are people sitting here today who are in need of baptism. I know the Lord is calling you. I know you have not yet made that decision publicly. When I joined the church, they made you march up front and declare it. I just ask that you put it on your card. And I will contact you. But I know there are people in this room that Jesus is calling. Maybe you're not ready for baptism. You just want to become a follower of Jesus. Maybe you've never been a follower of Jesus. Remember, we are those who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. You can make that decision today in your card. Maybe you just need more Bible studies. You need more information. Maybe you're ready to roll up your sleeves and get to work because you believe that this gospel must go to the world. And you're tired of majoring in the minors. And what you want to do is be a part of the big message of this gospel of resting in Jesus going to the world. There's places on your card for that. Or if you just need to cement your relationship with Jesus more, put in the prayer request. We want to pray for you. Let's do the last verse of our song and sing it like you mean it.
We are united in Jesus Christ our Lord. We are united in His love. Love for the waiting people of the world. People who need our Savior.
Dear Heavenly Father, there are still decisions to be made. There are still check marks to be put on cards. There are still things to be written in the prayer request time spots. There are still even names and information to be filled out on cards. Father, let your Holy Spirit go forward. These are your people. Put your spirit of conviction upon them for what your will is for their life. Let no one leave here without asking themselves, what is it that the Lord requires from me today? Father, thank you for sealing us in this truth and blessing us. In Jesus' name.